We welcome you to the More to This Story podcast. I am so glad that you have come along for this episode. And a lot of folks who are connected to my podcast will find this interesting and likely see some ties that go way back to some of the things that we're experiencing today. But first, those of you who listen to my podcast regularly know that this comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are sending forth trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that in a host of ways through academic programs, but also certificate programs and initiatives for lay members as well of churches. And really, when I think about what we're talking about today, our mission to develop trusted leaders for faithful churches, we're talking about one of those trusted leaders who serve faithful churches. And so I think this is very fitting for today's podcast. And if you're seeing this podcast in the early part of 2025 or late 2024, you'll be interested to know that we have a special class that we're offering this coming semester. It's a 6-week course on scriptural holiness. The Global Methodist Church has a denomination we serve, which is now, we have more than 400 students this semester from the Global Methodist Church. They've just adopted a mission statement. It says that their mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ and spread scriptural holiness across the globe. And this course is fitting right in with that idea. It's one of the distinctives that we have pushed and that we've lifted up for a long time for our 50-year history. But we wanted to just give some clarity to that, particularly thinking of folks who might not want to do that in an academic capacity. And also, I'd love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. And if you sign up for that list there, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And also, as you're getting going in this new year, I have several courses that are available for folks there, or maybe studies might be a better word. Courses makes you think of homework, but maybe if you're in a small group or Sunday school class looking for material, there's a group of lessons there on the book of Jude, 6 sessions there. There's another one dealing with the afterlife. I love for you to check that out at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. All right. I am so glad to welcome to the podcast my two friends. Tim Wildmon is the president of the American Family Association and American Family Radio, and MD Perkins is the producer and director of a new documentary called Culture Warrior. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andy. Hey. Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Man, we are so glad. We have been partners and friends of AFA for many years here at Wesley Biblical Seminary. Delighted to see this new documentary coming out. And so we want people to be able to check this out. It's called Cultural Warrior. It's the story of Don Wildmon. Tim Wildmon's on the line with me, but obviously his son and who serves and leads that organization now. And so I'm really excited about the opportunity for this. I was able to preview and endorse this movie. And as a Christian leader, I was just inspired by it. Tim, let's just start with you. What was it that led to getting this documentary going?
Well, MD was the producer of it. Yeah. And I think that he and our then Vice President, Buddy Smith, who's also on the board of directors.
Yes, yeah.
For Wesley Biblical Seminary. So Buddy was on staff then at the time, and I think they thought together, hey, let's do this and let's document. It's a documentary, right?
Yes.
Let's document how American Family Association got started, and the person most responsible for that was my dad, Don Wildmon, and how that whole happened, and put it down because it had never been, it had never really been, quote, documented in the way that Michael, MD, wanted to do. So those two gentlemen in particular, I think, deserve credit.
Absolutely. And MD, we've had you on the podcast before talking about your book, Dangerous Affiliation, but also some of your other projects talking about scripture and sexuality. So you come at this as a filmmaker. So I'm curious, like those two, were those the first 2 projects you did for AFA?
No, my first project goes back to about 2014 when I started here. But, we were working on a documentary called In His Image, Delighting in God's Plan for Gender and Sexuality, and doing all of that research on the sexuality issue. led to the book Dangerous Affirmation, The Threat of Gay Christianity. It's a study about the Revoice slash Side B movement.
Yeah.
And in the midst of that, I mean, it's interesting, we actually started the research for this documentary about Don, Culture Warrior, going back to about 2018, but I kind of put it on the back burner there because I started doing the sexuality research. But what's interesting is I really felt like I needed to go through that process of that deep level research on a topic like this and to present it to people, because it really put me in a position where I experienced a lot of what Don went through, of digging in on a particular topic, doing the research, feeling confident in the statements that you're making about it, and then to present it to people and also receive the pushback of a lot of people not caring and a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
people not wanting to hear what you had to say. And so yeah, that's kind of that's how those two things interact. I mean, I'm a filmmaker. I work with American Family Studios, but I also do research projects that are kind of specialized for some of the things that we want to do. So, our documentary work ties both of those things together in a lot of ways.
Also, Andy,
Yeah.
good information there, MD. That also, my dad, Don Wildmon, if you're not, I guess, 50 years old and up, you weren't involved, you didn't follow the Christian world back in the last quarter of the 20th century. My dad's name may not mean a lot, but he was very impactful. 70s, 80s, 90s. I say he and the organization which he headed
Yeah.
up, and the conservative Christian movement was very significant in our country's politics, in our country's culture, and that's what began the culture wars. That's why my dad's MD named the movie Culture Warrior. Really was because Dad was a leader in the culture war. Culture war is defined in the Judeo-Christian worldview versus the secular humanist worldview, if I can boil it down to two different, and the clash that was played out in America during those decades that I just mentioned. And my dad's place in that was basically one of the generals
Yeah.
in the culture war. So
Yeah.
it needed to be put down in film for posterity and for our supporters and for history.
Well, I mean, that's one of the roles of history, is to inform the future. And as we look at it, like I'm somebody, I can't say it for much longer. I'm 44, so
Okay.
I'm under 50. So I'll admit, before I came to WBS, I didn't know your father's name
Right.
or your name, but I knew AFA, and I
Right.
knew of the organization. I knew kind of the broad movement. My parents would have
Right.
been people who would have likely participated and benefited from the materials that
Right.
you all produced, that your dad produced. Now, it's interesting. You brought up the title of the movie and the reality of the culture war. Most of the time, that moniker is used in a negative way. Oh, I don't want to be a culture warrior. But here in this title, you guys fully embrace that. And I like it. I think it's helpful because I think it is something worth warring over. But I'm curious, is that something you all have ever tried to back away from, the idea of being a culture warrior?
I'll defer to MD and then I can talk about it too, but go ahead, MD.
Um, well, I mean, from a personal standpoint, my personal connection, I have not always wanted to be associated as a culture warrior, just personally. I would say really coming to AFA and coming to understand their mission and focus and the emphasis, the trust in the leadership that's here, the integrity of the leadership and all of those things were things that helped me to realize the importance of the culture war. And then, within the documentary, I don't know, Don had such a varied life and so many different points of interest. His biography that he wrote early on was called "The Man the Networks Love to Hate." Now that only deals with one aspect of Don's fight, which was with the networks and network television and TV advertising, things like that. I mean, he got into issues of pornography, secular humanism, as Tim mentioned, the homosexual agenda, and all of these other things. And in addition to just trying to be faithful as a father, as a pastor, and all these different things. So when I tried to think of what term kind of best encapsulate him, culture warrior seemed to be the one that really brought all of those things into focus in a way that also maintained the message of where AFA is and continues to be now. And so Don Wildmon and the Battle for Decency is the subtitle for that, because we're trying to acknowledge that it is dawn, but it also is a battle that's ongoing. And also the word decency kind of calls us back to that earlier time in the 70s and 80s when that word decency was still kind of used a little bit in common parlance and things like that. So, yeah, the idea of being a culture warrior, I think, is something that's off-putting to some people. They've kind of been fed that line that we shouldn't be involved in the fight. But that's part of what I wanted to accomplish with the documentary, is to make that connection for younger viewers and for viewers who maybe have forgotten about why we even fight some of the battles that we're fighting, and to bring it back to that sense of history that began there in the 70s and 80s with Don.
Yeah, that's helpful. Tim, you want to add to that about the idea of why using that language can be helpful?
Well, I think the negative implications of that term, as you talked about it being understood as negative by some people, even in the Christian community, is that a lot of Christians don't want to be perceived as being fighters, right? Or being divisive, or, we're supposed to be peacemakers and love other people and, and not, not be self-righteous and superior and all the things that, that you have to parse out and explain and talk about and say, no, I'm not this. And and also it's the way that the mainstream news media and the press and the entertainment industry and others stereotype us. As they already think we're, believe in superstitious things. When we're people who believe in Bigfoot and, if you believe in God and the God of the Bible and all those things. And also the secularists and worldly people and people who they don't like any kind of pronouncements of absolute morality. Okay.
Yeah.
You do that, they're gonna, unless it's their morality, but they don't want to hear it from the Christians.
Right.
So all that means that if you're somebody who unashamedly talks about right and wrong, moral values, evil, good, and you do that out in the secular public, you are going to be Elmer Gantry. Okay. That precedes Don Wildmon, by the way, by about 50 years. But you're going to be a Yahoo, you're going to be a religious nut, and you're going to be keep your moral values off my lawn. People don't want you to be making pronouncements of good and bad and so forth. So all that is why my dad was one of the ones who was perceived as especially from Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
A rural pastor from Mississippi on national television talking about too much sex and violence on TV. Well, that's made for mockery, right?
Yes.
So anyway, but culture warrior, back to your original question, does properly say what my dad was at the time.
I love there's a section with your mother where she said on the documentary, "Oh, I'm glad that your dad said something like this. I'm glad if they think that I'm from the country and that I'm slow, I'm not very smart, because it works to my advantage. Like, he can come in and they underestimate him." And I think that certainly was true. Now, there's an interesting moment that's talked about several times in this documentary. And Tim, you were there, and I heard the story. You had a part in it, and it all started. Your father was a Methodist minister, serving in North Mississippi, and I'd love to get to even some of that Methodist piece at some point. But it came on a particular evening during the Christmas season. I think
Right.
you know what I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
this is a legendary story, which was really the start. So tell us what it
Yeah.
was that was the start of
Yeah.
AFA.
Yeah. Of course, again, you got to put this in context of the times. We're talking about December 1976. Okay.
Okay.
So there's no internet. Okay. There's 3 or 4 television channels that was ABC, NBC, CBS, and maybe PBS. This is even
Mhm.
before Fox. This is
Wow.
before CNN. There wasn't even satellite TV at the time. I think that just preceded satellite TV. What I'm saying is 3 television networks dominated American pop culture. And so what was shown on those 3 television networks in the evenings, primetime television, reached the vast majority of Americans. Okay. Okay. You're talking. So imagine that. Today we're balkanized, right? Everybody's got their own channel and it's, I mean, a great night on Fox News is 3 million people.
Wow.
Okay. I'm talking in the evening. Okay. So we're a country of 340 million people. So that just goes to
Hmm.
show you. But back in those days, you had probably, in any given night, probably half of America watching network television. So watching
Wow.
the same channels, the same programs. So my dad saw the impact that those channels, those stations, those shows, night after night after night, teaching that, sex without commitment, without morality was the norm, was okay. And if you had any values, you were an old fogey, you know, and violence began to be more popularized on television, graphic violence as a way to solve problems and get your way. And the heroes were becoming darker as opposed to the heroes of, previous times, which you could tell a stark difference between good and bad. And then the language that was being allowed on television was language that was in the, prior to the probably 90s was considered unacceptable behavior in public. Not that that language, profanity and obscenities weren't used, but they just weren't allowed on in mainstream pop culture until those times. So Dad began to see, and those are symptoms of the overarching problem, as Dad describes it, as a worldview change between the
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
America being generally accepting of the Christian view of man versus
Yes.
the secular humanist view of man, where there is no God. Everybody
Hmm.
makes up their own right and wrong. That was the push going on with the worldview being communicated through the entertainment programs. So that night you're talking about was December 1976, where my dad was pastoring in South Haven, Mississippi, First Methodist Church, and one night, myself and 3 siblings gathered around TV. We were going to watch TV. We were home. It was winter, Christmas holidays, winter outside. So we were going to watch TV, and Dad said he couldn't find a channel. Sex, violence, profanity. That's precluded us from watching 3 different shows on 3 different networks. And he finally just said, "Turn it off." And it was that night that he had the idea of, I think it was that night, basically, that's when God put the spark in him about what we are talking about today, 40 something years later. And the idea of calling his church to turn off the TV for a week,
Yeah. Yeah.
turn off the television week. And what I don't, he didn't know, Dad didn't know what to do. He was just trying to do something in response to what he was seeing happen. And when he did that, the news media, the local news media in the Memphis area caught on to it, and they ran a story in the Commercial Appeal. It's a Memphis newspaper, and then some of the local TV news caught on. Well, that went viral in today's vernacular. That's what we
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
call it. It went at that time. You would say the story went national on the wire, and Dad began to get invitations to appear on Ted Koppel and all kind of news shows. And but the response was, Dad began to get letters and phone calls and checks and things from people all over America saying, finally, somebody's doing something and somebody's saying something. I agree with you. Tell me what to do next,
Wow.
kind of thing. So that's
Wow.
the organization, that's the night that you're talking about, which really birthed the National Federation for Decency, which later became what today is the American Family Association.
Amazing. I love that story. It's just like I've started with a pastor sensing a response
Right.
and then doing something about it for what he was called to do. And then that was what sparked this movement. MD, you want we won't go through every month of the history of AFA, but that then, I mean, led to a bold move for him to lead. And I'm glad for either of you to jump in, but just bouncing back and forth here. For Don to leave the pastorate and to start an organization as a result of this. Tell us a little about that next phase, and then we'll kind of jump into some of the kind of overarching themes.
Yeah, I mean the idea that Don's frustration, I think he dug in and did a lot of research in that time between that night in December 76 and the launch of the Turn the Television Off week, which is in the end of February into March of 77. And in that time, one of the things that he uncovered was something called the television code, which was something that the National Association of Broadcasters had basically compiled to define what the guidelines would be behind all of their broadcasting and all of the content material, the way in which they treat certain subjects like drug use and divorce and all of these different things. And if you read it, I mean, it's fascinating to just read it. It is written as if it was coming from a Judeo-Christian worldview regarding morality, and including, a fair treatment of religion, treating it with respect, treating God's name and his attributes. It even says God's attributes with respect and honor, and so this is what was underlying, and that TV code was put together in 1952. So in March 1st, 1977, 25 years after that was ratified, is when Don announces the launch of this new organization, the National Federation for Decency. And so, that was it. It's wild to kind of see the stark departure that had happened there. And I think, Don saw it there sitting in his living room in 76. But then once you read something like that and you see this is what all the networks signed on to define how they would be approaching these subjects. So I think there was initially a thinking that, like, maybe I can just remind people of this.
Yeah, sure.
And they'll listen. But you learn pretty quick that the network executives, the producers, they don't want to be told what to do, and they certainly don't want somebody outside or someone from lowly Mississippi to come in and tell them that maybe they're not doing things the way that they had agreed to do things. And so that's how this movement kind of started to center around a boycott kind of advocacy component, because Don also recognized, well, they're being the money that's being supplied to these shows comes through the advertising. And so we can kind of make a consumer advocacy connection of Christians and others who are concerned about, Three's Company, or later Hill Street Blues, and, Love Boat, and for Fantasy Island. These are some of the shows that were problematic at the time. If you could highlight the problem there and make the connection to, well, Sears is the one who's funding most of what's happening on Three's Company. So if you can put the pressure on Sears, maybe they'll actually listen. And then if they listen, then maybe the networks will begin to listen and start to change their approach. And so that's how all of these kind of pieces of what AFA has been involved in from the beginning kind of fit together there in those early days.
Yeah. So Don did this, and he recognized what was happening. His first tack, and correct me if I'm wrong, just he went to the executives trying to get them to move, but instead he realized they weren't going to change. Instead, like, he realized, and this is a bold thing to say, that these networks were anti-Christian, that they were, and he had this bold statement of saying they were trying to reshape society. That's what the networks were trying to do, and they weren't responding to the initial appeal. So he then moved to the boycott angle. Like, to be able to come to, and now some people might not recognize this. honestly, it would MD the cuts that you had of the various shows. Now, to me, somebody again, 44 years old. So in the 80s, I was a child. In 90, these were shows that were on reruns, and by the time that was happening, it was things had moved in such a bad direction. But the idea of Three's Company and some of these other shows like The Love Boat, you can't say like how dramatic of a shift this was. I mean, what was happening is really trying to assault the basic fiber of what was behind the American family. So, Tim, was that the basis of this? It was like the moving toward the boycotts, and where the yeah.
Yeah, those television shows you're talking about in that day, of course, they were very popular, but that would be considered mild.
Yeah.
By today's standards, in the era of the Kardashians and the kinds of things that we see in pop culture today, just, well, it's kind of what my dad warned would happen if things didn't stop at the time. They were beginning to start in the 70s and 80s to be more, how would you say, more pornographic, quite frankly, in many ways, and more vulgar. But what was happening with those, it wasn't that every one of those shows and every episode of those shows was something objectionable. That wasn't true. But it was that, okay, let's take a Three's Company, for example. The whole premise is a guy living with two women, two girls, and open sexuality. Well, the premise of a lot of the episodes on The Love Boat was people hooking up.
Right.
People hooking up
culture
with one
before
another.
Hookup culture.
Yeah. So it wasn't that they were showing people having sex, but they were the implication and as far as they would go in terms of the skin that they would show would be to promote the idea of that there are no absolute moral values when it comes to human sexuality. That was night after night after night after night after night. Okay, compare that to 40 years, 30 years prior to when Ricky and Lucy wouldn't get in the same bed together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the I Love Lucy show from the 40s and 50s. I guess it was 40s. I know it was 50s. Anyway, because the networks didn't want to show something that would promote immorality. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the contrast over the decades is well, they it was scandalous when Rhett Butler said, frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a DA.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? DAMN. So that was, that you hear that at the grocery store today, standing in line. I mean, people oftentimes people use open. So I'm just saying that's how vast the times have changed from the previous from back. And so when my dad was beginning to fight against these things, it wasn't those. Yes, it was incidents and specifics, but it was also the idea that they were changing the view of human sexuality to promote promiscuity.
Yeah.
And Dad said that will have harmful effects on our society for a long, long time to come if that becomes the norm. And here we are.
Yeah. And you had in that, now he started to put pressure on these TV networks through their sponsors.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. Like, and did that work at the time? It certainly at least gave him a voice in the public conversation. But tell us about that.
Okay. So Dad was very shrewd. He was very, I don't know how it's expressed. He had a lot of horse sense. Okay. Ed Vitagliano, one of our vice presidents here, said Dad had the uncanny ability to see around corners. So, well, so what I'm saying, and you combine that, and those are gifts from God, right?
Yes.
You combine that with God calling you to a particular mission, as in pulling you out of your comfort zone, out of what you know, and saying, I'm setting you apart for something I have for you to do here on earth. that's going to be wildly different than anything you've ever known. Talking about my dad in terms of his.
Yes.
So God has him lead the pastorate, but so I say that to say this. Dad figured out the network's executives don't really care what I have to say. Okay, they want to ignore me and the message that I represent from behalf of millions of Americans, but they do care, but they only care to the extent maybe you could hurt their viewership of their shows. But what they really cared about is money. And money came through the big companies that bought advertising time on the television networks. So Dad figured, okay, how can we impact network television? Well, we apply pressure to their money source. Their money source is Sears and Walmart and Kroger and, Boeing and I don't know, GE, whatever. These big corporations that spend millions of dollars buying advertising on the networks, if they feel the heat from regular Americans, as in they may not buy their product, then they're going to be responsive to that.
Yeah.
And then they're going to tell the networks, hey, we don't want to have our ads on shows that promote the kind of stuff that Reverend Wildmon's talking about over here. Okay, so keep us out of that because we don't want any controversy. We just want to sell widgets. All right.
Yeah, exactly.
So to speak. So that was the whole concept. Is really, that's kind of American as the apple pie. It goes all the way back to the Boston Tea Party. Does it?
Yeah,
the left
sure.
uses it all the time.
Yeah, sure.
They use those kind of. So that was his idea, and it worked very effectively for a long time, probably 20 years. It worked pretty effectively, not always, but there were enough times where we were able to achieve our objective that Dad began to develop a real reputation as a culture warrior, right? And as somebody who could win.
Wow.
Go up against the big boys and could win. Sometimes, not every time, but could win. So they were. He was feared by many of the networks, and so what he would say mattered. That's why he began to get a lot of national attention.
I love it. I love it. Now, MD, he put together this a whole organization then that was connected. There were state chairs. There's a radio network that comes about. There was ways to make this happen. Some people just wouldn't know the first thing to do. What are some of the things that he did, the tasks that he put in front of people of ways to respond?
Well, I mean, AFA has always been involved in a call to action. It's never been just about informing people. It's always the next step of how can I get involved? And so, I mean, it's funny. One of the early things that he did was called the Talkback book. I bet Tim remembers that. We don't mention it in the documentary, but it actually just had addresses and phone numbers of all of these different corporate sponsors, so that if you were ever watching something and you ever wanted to respond individually, it didn't have to be a collective call from NFD or AFA, that you were able to kind of track down where you could send a letter, where you could put a phone call, and just let your voice be heard. Because in those days, the corporations were a little more responsive than they are now to feedback from regular people. And if people were upset about something, that's one of the things that Don would say, especially when they got into fighting pornography in the convenience stores.
Yes.
Is that very often what he found is that there were store managers who actually would prefer not to sell pornography at all, but they couldn't just remove it on their own volition. They had to have a complaint from somebody formally in writing or a document, that a phone call had come in complaining that they weren't going to shop there anymore because they were selling these magazines. And, Don would use that as a call to action to remind people, like, if you speak up, you can make a difference. Because, the thing is, like, if you personally have a problem with something, you walk into a store and they're selling a Playboy and you're like, well, I don't want to shop here anymore, and you just leave. Well, that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Your personal convictions are met, but you're not giving any opportunity for public witness to take place. And
Yes,
I think
yes.
that was really what part of this whole boycott initiative is involved in, from even a theological level you could speak of, is the opportunity for public witness to come forth, because now you're giving an opportunity for repentance or response, or just bearing the truth out in the public square. And so and oftentimes, he found that on the beneficial side, that was actually a positive, that people would listen to you if you came in there and complained more publicly to the manager. And so you could actually generate some sort of public good would come out of it too, not just you taking a personal stand or whatever. But one of those famous quotes, and we have it in the documentary, is God has called us not to be successful, he's called us to be faithful.
Amen. Yes,
And
yes.
so that kind of recognition of God's providence and his hand in it, I think is part of the unique aspect of Don and his story that I hope viewers take away from the documentary, as well as anything that AFA does, because that's not just a slogan that still resonates here at AFA. I mean, I think Tim and the rest of the leadership really try to live under that moniker, that the success belongs to the Lord, and we're called to be faithful. Whether or not we see what we deem to be success in this fight is in his hands, but we do need to stand up and speak out and speak for him on
Yes,
this.
amen. Amen. I love how what you're able to do in this documentary is trace this story. So he moves from like what he does in his local church to create an organization that's working with networks, and then eventually to the boycotts, but then working through pornography and seeing the influence of pornography on society. Then, of course, the normalization of homosexuality. And then just before that, like there was this interesting scene where there was a lawsuit where Tim, they came after your dad in an intense way, Playboy magazine, and I guess some other groups too. But there was a sense like, is he allowed to do this? Like, and he stood up strong to that. And AFA had to you had to put yourselves together in such a way legally where you had to stand up for the rights of anybody to make a protest.
Yeah, there was a period of time there, probably from like, I don't know, 81, 82 to probably 87, 88, where the efforts of my dad and some other organizations led to uh, the at least the pornography sales, yeah, of like magazines in stores at that time, namely Playboy and Penthouse, for example. They were hit hard. Okay, they were like, I'm talking like probably they lost. Well, I know when 7-Eleven quit selling them, that was like 4,500 stores in one day. Well,
Wow.
and then total in Eckerd Drugs at the time, that was very popular. They probably lost. Tom Thumb, I think, was a convenience store chain. They probably lost 40 or 50. I don't know. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, I would say 40,000 distribution outlets across
Yeah.
America stopped selling the magazines. Well, that got Playboy and Penthouse really ticked because that was costing them a lot of money, a lot of
Yeah.
money. And who did they hold responsible for that? Well, namely my dad.
Yes.
And so they sued him. And MD knows more about that probably than even I can remember. But I know, um, I know we won. The cases they sued him for like interference of business, wasn't it, MD? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it was RICO violations because it was tied to
Which
one of the state affiliates in Florida initially, because of the protests that were happening there, the success that was having, and then they were trying to say that they were basically extorting uh,
Right.
It was an act of extortion, which was ridiculous. But of course, it tied everything up in the legal
Yeah.
sphere, and the things were kind of settled and put away without it having to go to trial or anything because it was a frivolous thing. But
Right.
it was an
Yeah.
intimidation tactic, quite frankly.
Yeah.
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 All he was saying, all my dad was saying is, you don't like pornography being sold in your town through 7-Eleven, don't shop there.
Yeah, that's right.
And by the way, but he would also organize pickets.
Hmm.
So it was a public shaming,
Yeah, no.
of the stores that were selling pornography. So they didn't like it. It cost them a lot of money, and so they tried to shut him down legally, but it didn't work.
Yeah. Part of this is an issue of the First Amendment, right? And this would often come up. I loved, MD, that you showed these old TV shows, like, I don't know if it's Donahue or those type of things, where he
Hmm.
was on and people would be critical of him. They point their finger at him and to say, well,
Oh
who are
yeah.
you to tell me what to watch? But he had such a grasp of this basic right. And didn't he like understand like what he was calling society to? Like the public's not just asking for this. Instead, the public does want to respond, but they just don't have a voice. And so he was
Yeah,
that voice.
the common criticism was always censorship.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
mean, he would quickly say, I mean, the public can't censor you. I mean, that's what the First Amendment is about the government censoring you from freedom of speech. It's not about us kind of mitigating our own language or choosing what we want to see or what we don't want to hear or those kinds of things. I mean, there's all kinds of ways. We have the example in there. He's being interviewed and he said, you know, you're going to edit. I'm giving you an interview right now, but you're going to edit this, and that's not censorship. I'm self-editing myself as I'm choosing the words that I'm going to say. That's not censorship. But this is how it often got displayed because somehow in the midst of all of this, of course, the mainstream media behind it, the pornographers were held up as the champions of the First Amendment. I'm sure you remember in 1996, there's that movie, The People versus Larry Flint, which kind of paints him as this paints Larry Flint, the publisher of was it Pen or it was
Hustler.
Hustler magazine, yeah, as this champion of the First Amendment or whatever, which he was just a despicable guy who was actually, just kind of branding his movement and his lust behind this First Amendment kind of thing. When really, I mean, a lot of what he was presenting was prosecutable as obscenity under the law, and that was
Right.
also Don's point, is that these things, there's still rules on what you can and can't say and what you can and can't publish, and that's not under the First Amendment forms of censorship either.
Yeah.
But it was just getting district attorneys, frankly, who were courageous enough to actually take these cases on. So many of the AFA affiliates in different states and local chapters ran into those issues constantly when they would try and bring up issues. They finding a favorable district attorney to actually take up a case against a convenience store or somebody who was promoting this was often very challenging and was often the real wrench in the whole thing to try and get any change on this, was actually getting somebody courageous enough to actually stand up and prosecute.
Right. This is such an interesting challenge that he had to have to be able to still move forward with it and recognize the reality of him using his speech to help shape a better society. And I thought there was this interesting moment where you had a speech in this documentary from Don where it was late. My guess was is later in his ministry where he began to say, I see what's tying all this together. It was not just decency on TV, pornography, homosexuality. It's instead, it's a Christian view of man, of humanity. Like this was like, and essentially like, this is not just one issue. It's an issue of a Christian worldview that was at the foundation of what was happening. Tim, is that what you all see now, like in this digital age, as you're thinking about like how AFA continues to serve the church and the world, like how you take these principles from your dad into the future? I'd love to hear how you guys are doing that now. Just a brief word on what AFA is doing these days.
Well, so are you familiar with the American Humanist Association? Have you ever heard of that?
Just a little bit, just
Okay,
barely.
well,
Yeah.
They were more popular yesteryear than they are today. But so the American Humanist Association, they promoted what's called the Humanist Manifesto. Okay. And I remember my dad reading that, and then he said, "We're going to publish this." And I don't know how he got the rights to do it, but evidently, I don't know how, maybe it was public. I'm not sure. But we published the Humanist Manifesto, which was like the word says, it was a these things we believe, written out by humanists. Well, humanists believe that man is God. They don't believe in a supernatural God. They believe that man is God, and so they reject anything that they reject the idea of a supernatural being. So, so they didn't believe in any morals when it came to sex. So they said that out loud. But the reason I bring this up is Dad began to he would publish that and then send it out all over the country to educate the Christian community on the worldview clash that was going on, and also the fact that this worldview, this humanist worldview, if you don't know what that is, you need to look it up. Secular humanism, okay? Because that's today in politics, it's called progressivism, okay?
Yeah.
But it's so what they would do though with this is they began to promote this in the public school systems and on college campuses and on university campuses. This worldview, so it wasn't only on pop culture, i.e., network evening television, but in music, in magazines, and began to also in Darwinism. This comes from Darwinistic evolution. It's hand in hand with secular humanism. So
Yeah.
this goes all the way back to the 40s, maybe previous to that. Anyway, so that began to get, so you combine what's going on in the public school system, which probably 95% of America's children attend, especially before the homeschooling and Christian schooling began to gain a lot of traction back in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. So all this is coming together and none of it's good. Okay, I'm talking about none of this education, whether it be an academic classroom education or education on TV, it was all going the wrong direction against our Christian heritage in America, and Dad saw that. And so he began to try to educate, especially pastors and Christian community on what was going on here.
Yeah. I'm so glad that he did. And I'm so thankful that AFA is still going in the work that God's called you to do. MD, do you want to jump in there? I know there's some initiatives that you've had too as well, like just in your department, so to speak.
I would say, I mean, that's kind of the continuing story of AFA is continuing to try and educate people, call people to activism, help equip the church for carrying out the Great Commission and all those different worldview, I mean, Tim talked about the negative worldview. I mean, part of the job now is to kind of rebuild the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview. And what are we supposed to think about sexuality and marriage? What are we supposed to think about family and, family obligations? What are we supposed to think about, patriotism and civic involvement and all these kinds of things? Because, I mean, we can only do so much with with secular culture kind of constantly eroding the foundations, but we can help Christians who are interested, who want to know, who want to learn, who want to be able to train their children and want to help to rebuild America's foundations to some degree. So, that's the work that we're involved in with American Family Studios. I mean, we've got a very outward facing part of the ministry because we're producing documentaries and curriculums and things like that that a lot of people get to see. And of course, American Family Radio kind of does that on a day-to-day basis with current events and social issues. And here's what's happening today, and how do we think about this, and kind of bringing the common sense and the Christian worldview together to help Christians kind of wade through the muddle and the mire of everything that's going on in society. So, having looked at the history of AFA, I see all of these threads kind of tie together to where we are now. I'm not surprised to kind of learn that each of these things is a facet of the history. It's just interesting to see kind of where each of these where each piece of this concern kind of came out, to where AFA is so multifaceted now, with a news department and radio and video and the online components, the print media, and all these different things that we're doing. But it kind of speaks to Don's bigger vision of the need for Christians to be informed and to have media that they could trust, they could kind of help to wrestle through the issues of day-to-day life.
Yes, it's so good. You guys have so much going on. For instance, just recently, I've had multiple times on my podcast, Katie Faust. I know you all are starting to work with her, and just the positive messages that you have going out. Of course, another person you've worked with on our faculty is Dr. Robert Gagnon, and thankful for the work that he's done with you guys. One of the things, I know we're kind of running out of time, but I loved at the end of this documentary, there was this moment where I can't remember the speaker you had on, but who described Don as a sod buster. And I thought this was, I didn't know what he meant, but he was talking about somebody who went out into like the Western frontier and was the first one to break up the dirt and like to actually get things going. And then it was like generations later that realized the fruit of that labor. And that's what I think part of the legacy is of AFA and Don, was that he was able to be here breaking up that sod. And like you said, Tim, he was seeing around the corner long before anybody else did. And so I'd love for you just to think about this what you see as this ongoing legacy, Tim, of your dad. And so thankful. I just want to say on behalf of WBS, how thankful we are for his influence.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a lot of what Dad was talking about in the 70s and 80s was not understood by even many in the church, because it was prophetic. By prophetic, I mean in the sense that he was looking down the road at what would happen to our country if we kept on, mocking the things of God. Okay.
Yes.
And I'm talking broadly and generally, again, as a country. But he could see what would happen. Well, you can look at the Bible and see what happens to people, right? And groups of people, if they mock God too many times or too much or without repentance. And so what he would write a lot of times would be like, oh, that can never happen. Good grief. This guy's off his rocker. Okay, if he thinks that we're ever going to have two men getting married in America.
Yeah.
Or that, abortion would be a means of birth control. That'll never happen, in America. So we'll never turn away. We'll never embrace the idea that, man came from monkeys. He's a reactionary, that'll never happen. So, but you know what? I think now you look back and you go, well, there were some other people that were doing the same thing. That Chuck Colson. I remember reading Chuck Colson's books, going, wow, that's prophetic. If he's saying the same thing my dad was saying.
Yeah.
James Dobson, D. James Kennedy, and then of course some of the Baptist and Methodist, Adrian Rogers, and some of the people that you would be familiar with, Andy, in the Methodist Wesleyan movements. They're coming from all Catholics. They were coming from all different denominations and streams of Christianity, but they were seeing the same things happening and what would happen if we kept on the same road. Sadly, a lot of those things have already, we're in the middle of them right now. Right? Who knows where this experiment called America ends, but it can end. Okay.
Yeah, you're right.
It can.
Yeah.
Okay, you look back to human history, there are civilizations that have risen and fallen.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they fall because they turn away from the God of the Bible that gave them, especially the ones that were created by him in the first place, like Israel.
Yes.
And the stories in the Bible. And now I believe absolutely that the United States of America in particular was birthed by God. You look at our founder. Now, this is a whole other topic for a whole other day, but with people more well versed on it than I am. But you don't you don't just have a country birthed to defend individual liberty. Okay.
Right.
In a history and a world of tyrants and kings and pharaohs and what? Religious liberty? First Amendment, Second Amendment, self-government, representative republic, those things, that just didn't happen. And so God used that providentially to birth America. And so America was really, we represent what's called Western values. And even more specifically for a long time, 1892, the Supreme Court of the United States said, well, the United States of America is a Christian country. That was the Supreme Court. Said it's a Christian country. Now, what it didn't mean everybody was a believer. It meant that our country respected and honored the Christian religion as a basis for our, laws, our traditions, our morality, and all those things. So anyway, I just think that we're not in a good way right now with respect to all those things, and whether God sends revival or not. But we're called here, as my dad says, as MD pointed out. Called to be faithful. I would say not necessarily successful, although it's nice to be successful.
Sure.
Every once in a while, right? You want to win a ball game, right? You don't want to go
right.
over. Okay, so when you win a ball game, to use a sports metaphor. So we just keep fighting, keep plugging. Us and other groups, like everybody's got their lane in this. Wesley Biblical Seminary, you guys are training pastors and evangelists and missionaries in the same worldview we're talking about here today. We reach people with our radio network, with our magazine, with our films. And other ministries are doing the same thing. We're all working together to try to preserve what God's given us here in our country.
Amen. Yes. Yeah, we are. And I'm so thankful for you. MD, tell us again, like I hope that this documentary is successful, right? I know it's faithful and I'm thankful for that.
Right.
But where can people find out about this and when does it come out? Tell us a little bit more information about this documentary, Culture Warrior.
Yeah, the movie Culture Warrior is available now. You're able to watch it for free. Go to culturewarrior.movie. That's the website, culturewarrior.movie. A very brief registration, email, name, and you'll be able to watch the movie for free through the website and share it, show it to other people. Do be aware that there are some strong images or strong subject matter within it, just because we are trying to show the realities of what Don was fighting against, in regards to pornography and obscenity and all of those things. So it's not necessarily sit down, a real young family together and watch it, as a movie night. But, as children are able to, and you have the maturity to handle it, definitely take the time to watch it and to talk about it, because I think trying to make the connection for people on this issue is part of why I think history is important for Christians to realize where we've come from, so that we can recognize where we are, and then we can figure out kind of where we need to go based on the current situations. Because as Solomon alluded to, there's nothing new under the sun. So there's some aspect of things in this life that are always cyclical, and we can always learn from things in the past that help teach us lessons for the future. And so that's why I think documentaries and historical books and just knowing your history is important. And here you have a case of being able to learn a little bit about fairly recent history.
Yes.
Even if you're younger age like I am, I was born in 1983, so I mean, already 6 years into the NFD project, so to speak. But I was aware, I knew the names of different shows. I knew Don's name because my parents were supporters and things like that. But being able to learn, why Don did what he did and what was motivating him, I think is really helpful. It was helpful and encouraging for me just at a personal level. It's given me a better appreciation for the ministry that I work for. But even more than that, I think it's given me a bigger sense of the call that Christians have, like Tim was talking about, to stand up and to speak the truth and to trust God in the midst of that. So we try to be faithful in that. So yeah, go to culturewarrior.movie and watch it. And I hope to hear from you, because I love to hear people's feedback on it.
Well, it's great. Also, Indy, one little thing I enjoyed, not being a movie maker or anything, I love that, every now and then you probably needed a picture that the family didn't have. Like, for instance, Don in his church working with children, and you were able to develop artwork that showed this, or like Don in his church, or Don before these various groups. Like, I just want to let people know this is like a very well done documentary.
Thank
and
you.
It's something that I think that you can watch with your kids. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's I appreciate you guys being here and for the work you're doing at AFA and AFR. It's a real blessing to us here at WBS. We're with you and we support you as you continue to go forward.
Appreciate it, Andy. Thank you for having us.